The sun hung low over Caldwell Creek, bleeding orange across the crooked rooftops and casting long shadows that stretched like accusations across the dirt road. The air tasted of dust and humiliation, thick enough to coat the back of a man's throat. Thomas Whitaker stood on the porch of the general store, his jaw tight, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Behind him, his wife stood silent. Her name was Clara. She wore a faded blue dress that had once been white, her hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. Her eyes were down. They had been down for weeks now, ever since the night he lost everything at the poker table in the back room of Hackett's saloon. $300. That was the debt. And Thomas Whitaker did not have $300. He did not have 30. He had a wife, a rented room above the livery, and a pride so brittle it cracked with every breath. The buyer arrived at noon. His name was Cyrus Moon, a cattle broker from the Eastern Territories. He rode in on a black gelding with silver tack that caught the light like broken glass. Cyrus was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a gut that strained against his vest and a smile that never reached his eyes. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud, and walked toward the porch with the gait of a man who had never been told no. "Whitaker," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. Thomas nodded once. His throat was dry. "Moon." Cyrus looked past him, his gaze settling on Clara. He studied her like she was livestock. His eyes moved from her face to her hands, to the line of her neck, to the worn heels of her boots. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only made it worse. "She healthy?" Cyrus asked. Thomas swallowed. "Yes." "Can she cook?" "Yes." "Clean?" "Yes." Cyrus stepped closer, close enough that Clara could smell the tobacco on his coat and the sweat beneath it. He reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers, turning her face side to side as if inspecting a horse's teeth. "Pretty enough," he said. "A little worn, but that's fixable." Thomas looked away. Somewhere behind the store, a dog barked. The sound felt distant, like it belonged to another world. Cyrus pulled a leather pouch from his coat and tossed it onto the wooden bench beside Thomas. The coins inside jingled softly, a sound that should have brought relief, but instead felt like the closing of a coffin lid. "300, Cyrus said. "Counted and sealed. She's mine now." Thomas reached for the pouch. His fingers brushed the leather, felt its weight. It was heavier than he expected, heavier than her silence, heavier than the 8 years they had spent together, the nights she had stayed up mending his shirts, the mornings she had woken before dawn to light the stove so the room would be warm when he rose. He picked it up, and that was when the stranger spoke. "I'll give you 600. The voice came from the shade of the livery across the street. All 3 of them turned. A man stepped into the light, tall and lean, with a black hat pulled low and a duster that hung past his knees. His face was hard to see in the slant of the sun, but his voice was clear, calm, and final. Cyrus bristled. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger did not answer. He walked forward slowly, his boots measured and deliberate, his hands loose at his sides. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and looked at Thomas. $600, he said again. "Cash. Right now." Thomas blinked. "For what?" "For her." The stranger's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Thomas. "But there's a condition." Cyrus laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can outbid me, Drifter? You don't even know what you're buying." The stranger ignored him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he counted out bills, one by one, onto the bench beside the pouch Cyrus had left. The bills were crisp, clean, the kind that had been kept dry and safe. $600 exact. "Condition is this," the stranger said, his voice flat. "She walks free. No debt, no claim. She goes wherever she wants." Thomas stared at the money. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Cyrus stepped forward, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. "Now hold on!" The stranger's eyes shifted to Cyrus. He did not move. He did not draw. He just looked at him. And in that look, Cyrus saw something that made his hand stop halfway to the grip. Something old and sharp and final. Cyrus lowered his hand. The stranger turned back to Thomas. "Take the money. Let her go." Thomas's hands trembled as he picked up the bills. His throat worked, his breath shallow. He looked at Clara, but she was not looking at him. She was looking at the stranger, her eyes wide and uncomprehending, as if she had just watched the sky split open. "Who are you?" she whispered. The stranger adjusted his hat. "Doesn't matter." "Why would you?" "Doesn't matter either." He turned to leave. Clara stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Wait, please. At least tell me your name." The stranger paused. For a moment it looked like he might turn around, but he didn't. He just spoke over his shoulder, his voice quiet but clear. "If you ever need anything, you can find me at Redstone Ridge." And then he walked away, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. Thomas stood on that porch, $600 in his hands, and felt the weight of his wife's silence heavier than any debt he had ever carried. Cyrus Moon spat into the dirt and rode off without another word, his pride cracked like old leather. Clara stood alone, free for the first time in 8 years, and did not know whether to cry or scream or laugh. So she did none of those things. She just watched the stranger disappear into the heat shimmer at the edge of town, and she memorized the shape of his back, the way he moved, the way he had not asked for anything in return. Thomas Whitaker did not sleep that night. He lay on the thin mattress above the livery, staring at the ceiling beams, the $600 folded beneath his pillow. He had paid Cyrus Moon. He had paid the saloon. He had even bought himself a bottle of whiskey to celebrate, but the whiskey tasted like ash, and the money felt like it was burning a hole through the cloth. Clara had not come back to the room. She had not said a word to him after the stranger left. She had just stood there on the porch, staring at the empty road, until finally she walked away. He did not know where she went. He did not ask. By dawn, he heard she had taken a room at the boarding house on 2nd Street. The widow who ran the place, Mrs. Callahan, had taken her in without question. Word spread fast in a town like Caldwell Creek. By noon, everyone knew what had happened. And by evening, everyone knew what Thomas Whitaker had done. He tried to go to the saloon that night, but the bartender would not serve him. He tried to sit at a poker table, but the men turned their chairs away. He walked past the church, and the preacher, a man who had never judged anyone, looked at him and shook his head. Thomas Whitaker had sold his wife, and no amount of money would ever wash that clean. 3 days later, Cyrus Moon came looking for the stranger. He rode into Redstone Ridge with 2 hired guns, men with dead eyes and fast hands. He asked around, but no one would talk. The bartender served him a drink and said nothing. The blacksmith shoed his horse and said nothing. Even the children, who usually ran up to strangers asking for candy, kept their distance. Finally, Cyrus found him. The stranger was sitting outside a small cabin at the edge of town, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked older than the territory itself. He did not look up when Cyrus and his men approached. "You humiliated me," Cyrus said, his voice tight with rage. The stranger kept whittling. "I'm talking to you, drifter." The stranger set the knife down slowly. He looked up, and his eyes were calm, almost bored. "You humiliated yourself," he said. Cyrus's hand went to his gun. One of the hired men stepped forward. The stranger did not move. He just looked at them, the same way he had looked at Cyrus back in Caldwell Creek. And once again, that look was enough. The hired men glanced at each other. One of them cleared his throat. "Boss," he said quietly, "maybe we should—" "Shut up," Cyrus snapped, but his hand had already moved away from the gun. He stared at the stranger for a long moment, his jaw working, his pride bleeding out like water from a cracked canteen. Finally, he turned his horse and rode away. The hired men followed. The stranger went back to whittling. 5 years passed. Clara worked at the boarding house in Caldwell Creek, saving every penny she earned. She learned to read from Mrs. Callahan's books, learned to keep accounts, learned to stand without flinching when men spoke too close or too loud. She changed, not all at once, but slowly, like a river cutting through stone. She thought about the stranger often. She did not know his name, but she knew his words. "If you ever need anything, you can find me at Redstone Ridge." She had not needed anything. Not money, not protection, not rescue. She had needed to learn how to be free. And now, 5 years later, she finally was. So she packed a small bag, told Mrs. Callahan she was leaving, and took the westbound stage to Redstone Ridge. The town was smaller than she expected, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. She asked at the general store where she could find the man who had paid for her freedom. The shopkeeper, an old man with kind eyes, looked at her for a long moment. "You're her, aren't you?" he said. Clara nodded. The old man's face softened. "He died 2 months ago. Fever took him." The world tilted. Clara steadied herself against the counter, her breath catching in her throat. "Where?" she whispered. "Cemetery, up on the hill. You can't miss it." She walked up the hill in silence, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The cemetery was small, just a few dozen graves beneath a stand of cottonwoods. She found his marker near the back, a simple wooden cross with words carved by hand. Silas McCoy, 1831 to 1882. Some men don't save the world, they just save one person. That is enough. Clara knelt in the dirt, her hand resting on the weathered wood. She had brought wildflowers, purple and yellow, picked from the roadside. She placed them at the base of the cross. "I finally learned your name," she said, her voice breaking. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, soft and constant, like a breath held too long and finally released. She stayed there until the sun set, until the shadows grew long and the first stars appeared. And when she finally stood to leave, she did not feel sadness. She felt something else, something quieter, deeper, gratitude. Not for the money, not for the rescue, but for the fact that a man she had never known had looked at her and seen not property, not a transaction, not a thing to be bought or sold, but a person worth setting free. She walked back down the hill, past the general store, past the saloon, past the small cabin where Silas McCoy had once sat whittling wood and asking for nothing in return. And for the first time in her life, Clara walked without looking back. Years later, when people asked her about the stranger who had saved her, she would tell them the truth. "He didn't save me," she would say. "He just gave me the chance to save myself." And in a world where most men took, Silas McCoy had given the only thing that truly mattered: freedom, without asking for anything, not even her name.